Azania, you've disappeared. All right. Are we ready? And I'll start recording in my end. Okay, do you look good, Azania? All right, I'm going to do my recording. Okay, today is March the 22nd, 2022. And I will now give it over to Azania for this. All yours.
Okay. Dad, so today you wanted to talk about DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement. Can you first start to describe, I know in your writings you talked about the radical tensions that were accumulating heavily in the 1967 that kind of led up to Uhuru and eventually DRUM. Can you talk a little bit about this upheaval that you mentioned?
Okay. Just a little background. In the 1960s, Detroit was a very prosperous city, but it was a very sharply racially divided city. And of course, there was growing tensions because during this period from the 1960s up until the 1970s was a very tumultuous decade of the 60s. And tension was just building increasingly as we moved through the 1960s. And Detroit, as I mentioned before, was a really like an apartheid city. And tensions were very great. And in 1967, Detroit exploded. It was the biggest urban rebellion in during that period. And of course, the military was dispatched to Detroit to supplement the state troopers. At the time of the rebellion itself in 1967, I was in exile, self-exile, political exile in Montreal, Canada. So I did not observe the rebellion firsthand. I had it basically described to me by friends and comrades. Right? So after that was in the summer 1967, I returned to Detroit in the spring of 1968, and
Sorry, can you tell me a little bit about the recaps your friends and comrades shared with you, since you weren't there at the time? And was your family like witnesses of anything that occurred? Because they were in Detroit.
That's right. So here are some of the, I guess, some of the vivid descriptions. Of course, during the rebellion, the state imposed a curfew on the city of Detroit, which essentially meant that all Detroiters were under house arrest. And people,
so was this similar to the curfews that were being put in place when George Floyd was murdered in the Twin Cities?
It was, yes, it was similar to that. Okay, and so the streets were patrolled by the U.S. military, state troopers, and sheriff's department and police department. And if people were on the streets, they began to round folks up, and they put them in. Some were taken to Belle Isle. At that point, they had a zoo in Belle Isle, and some of my friends were arrested and put in the elephant, and where they housed the elephants. Well, elephants weren't there when they were there, right? And so they had mass arrests, and mass arrests, they had to make makeshift places to hold a large number of folks who broke the curfew. Okay, and then of course
so why do you know why they were utilizing the zoo cages for people instead of, like, because there was such an overflow of people that were rejecting the curfew that they were putting them in animal cages? Is that what you're saying?
Okay. Well, they were trying to utilize whatever space, wherever they can contain people. So you contain animals in the zoo, right? And so that's why they use also the zoo as a place to confine folks. Now, some of these
You know,
people,
if
some of these
we're
people, okay. I was just saying some of these people weren't purposely violating the curfew. They were cut out. Some might have wanted to sneak to the store to get some things and all you know, just
do you remember what time the curfew was?
I don't know the entire time period in which that curfew was imposed.
Mhm. Do you know if it like impacted your family's like ability to go to work, or if do you know if like General Baker, John Lewis, Michael Hamlin, were they ever incarcerated during that time?
General Baker was incarcerated because I think he was one that described how he was incarcerated. And then what happened is this, you know, a lot of times industry and business must go on. So after they imposed the curfew, they allowed people who had jobs that can show that they had a badge to go to work or some evidence that they are going to work. So most of the cities, they don't want to shut down the economic activities of the city
Were
itself.
your parents impacted by it?
You know, as a matter of fact, I never had a discussion with my parents about the curfew and what they did. So that was so after the rebellion, and then of course the government tried to use the stick and a carrot, right? I mean, their stick was basically clamping down on radicals or people who were active and placing them under very close surveillance. And the other is that the Johnson administration, you know, this was during the so-called war on poverty in model cities. And so they attempted to initiate some programs, what they call basically, let me see, the slogan for it was model cities, right? Model cities kind of program. And they try to provide some grants for a community group to alleviate some of the poverty, you know, again, in the community. And it's during that time that my former comrades from the Uhuru basically created a newspaper. It was called the Inner City Voice. So when I returned from Montreal, Canada, in March of 1968, I began to work on the newspaper, you know, writing articles for the newspaper. And it was around that newspaper which served as an organ to organize basically the community. And our focus was going to be on our principal focus was going to be on organizing Black workers, right? And the rationale for that was that Detroit was sort of like an industrial hub of the United States. And many of the workers worked in the auto industry and all the steel industries and all those industries. So we felt that we could exercise power, economic power, in the form of labor power. We have demonstrated in the past that we can exercise economic power in terms of consumer power. And that's what was done during the Montgomery bus boycott. When he said, well, what happened is that as a result of the boycott, it basically made the bus company, it broke the bus company. They couldn't function without Black passengers. So, and Black folks have many times participated in boycotts, but we're going to basically use our economic power in industry to pressure the corporations and government to yield to some of our demands.
So with your friends, your comrades that were organizers, General Baker was did work in the automobile factory. Did you have any experience ever working there?
No, I never worked in auto plants. the closest thing I worked, closest thing for working in the auto plant was working in auto washes, in which you had a whole stream of cars. And you had to, for instance, my job was to hop in and out of the cars. I would go in and do all of the inside windows and wipe off the dashboard. And then I would have to hop out of that car and hop into the next car because it was coming down the line and do the same. And that was similar to what was happening in the factory. You had basically an assembly line and people doing little small jobs on each unit as it went down the conveyor line. So it was, I was familiar with how it was to work on an assembly line. Okay.
Do you remember your father working there?
No, my father worked when he worked at Ford. He worked at Kaiser Fraser. So I don't know exactly. All I know is he did manual labor, and the particular jobs he did, I don't know.
And in your writings, you said that one thing that was a strong organizational and educational tool for these workers and also like management in particular was the inner city voice that you all had created through Drum. Can you talk a little bit about that newsletter, the monthly newsletter that you all created?
Okay. Let me go and begin to talk about what happened when I returned from Canada. Some of my former comrades in Uhuru and a few others went on a retreat. You know, we went to Idlewild, which is a small town in Michigan. And during this retreat, we began to strategize, create a strategy and a plan, a strategic plan for organizing Black people in Detroit. And our plan was this, that we wanted to lay the groundwork of building what we call a Black Liberation Party. And this was going to be a political party, and the foundation of that party would be Black workers. And we would also, but within that framework would also be Black students and Black community groups. But we felt that the Black workers in the factories were the key segment that we were going to focus on. And we used the newspaper was going to be our organizing organ. It was a way that we can reach the total Black community and raise awareness and politicize the community. And the newspaper was our means for doing that. And so what we, and then all of us, we knew that what we were building was going to be organic, meaning that we had grassroots ties with the people that we were organizing and recruiting. And those people were like us in terms of our history, in terms of the neighborhoods we live in terms of our relatives, in terms of our friends. So we had that kind of connection with the people we were attempting to organize. And the formation of what happened in the Dodge Revolutionary movement was that General Baker and another founding members, Chuck Wooten, were working at an automobile Chrysler plant in Hamtramck. And they were involved in a wildcat strike because some of the issues in the factories were speed up. There was no really serious medical service in the factories. And factories were very dangerous places to work. I mean, people losing fingers and limbs, and it was losing their lives. And those who worked, for instance, in the places where they painted cars, I mean, it was a toxic kind of environment, right? So it was very dangerous. And of course, the corporations were ignoring all of the health guidelines and health codes. So there was a lot of grievances. So there was a wildcat that involved a few Black and white workers. And of course, some of the workers were taken back except General Baker. Wooten. So we began to organize, focusing on Black workers to take actions against the rampant racism in the plants. So as we focus on the workers, we had two major targets. The racism practiced by the corporation and the racism practiced by the union, which was the UAW, which meant the United Automobile Workers. Now, Black workers renamed the UAW meant to the Black workers meant that you ain't white. Okay, that's how we translate it. And of course, many of the UAWs, the leaderships and those who ran the union were virtually all white, so there was no democratic representation of Black workers in the union structure itself. So that's part of the problem. Another problem is with the corporations, of course, in terms of hiring for positions, they have Black workers who are all, if you want to find a Black workers, here's the map that you will use. You will say, okay, where are the hardest jobs, or where are the jobs with the lowest pay? Which are the jobs where they're least likely to be promoted? That's where you find Black workers. That's how you will locate them. I mean, the worst jobs in the company, those are the jobs that were kind of sort of open to Black folks. And many other privileged, more advantaged jobs or upper level jobs were kind of like white reserves. So we can see that we wanted to focus on the segregation practiced by corporations and a kind of segregation within the union in terms of very few Blacks held leadership positions in the union itself. And at first, we didn't know whether to build a union outside that would challenge the UAW, just having an all Black union, or whether to work within the union and maybe form a caucus and be a sort of a caucus within the union. So those were some of the strategies and things that we had to struggle with and figure out which would be the better strategy or the focus. And so our first successful organization was in the Dodge plant. But what we wanted to do was build workers' organizations in factories all around the city and even beyond the city. And so the union, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement evolved as we spread into a league of Black unions at different factories. So we went from the drum was the first and the core, and it serves as a prototype of the model for forming unions in other locations, right? So growing from the drum to the league. And the idea again was that the workers could become a political force within the corporations, a political force within the union, and a political force more generally in terms of electoral politics in civilian society.
And in your ratings, you said that the majority of these Black union workers were first generation Southern Black people that migrated from the South. Can you talk to me a little bit about what it means to you to be a first generation Black person in the North? Just because when we think about first generation, we're really thinking about immigrant families and the first child that's born within, if that's a Hmong family, Somali family. So that's what first generation, I think, more popularized means. But when we think in the context within the African American identity, that's also something that's prevalent and very it's not the same to that international, because you also have children that carry kind of that duality of identities of your wife being an immigrant, so your children are kind of holding both of those and also holding kind of an ambiguous phenotypes at the same time. So just wondering how did you see that being navigated? Yeah, and what does it mean to you?
Okay. Well, first generation, in this context, let me do another sort of analogy. Many folks know about the first generation college students, right? In other words, that's a break in a pattern. So my parents and their parents and parents, you're breaking a pattern, okay? And so this was, so they were parents of children who were raised in a different environment, you know, a significantly different environment than in the South. If I had been raised in the South, I would have attended all Black schools. I would have lived in an all Black community. It wouldn't be a gray area. It was very strict. When I moved to Detroit, there was a gray area because in my schools, you know, like from junior high and on, were primarily a white environment, right? So my parents didn't go to school in a white environment. Our generation was the first one to be, so that's a big contrast. So first generation. So going back to the workers, their parents were workers in the South, and they're growing up. So they are sons and daughters of parents who come out of a Southern tradition. But but my peers, people like me and those workers, because they're like first generation workers, they were my peers. They were our counterparts. That we had to navigate in a predominantly white environment, and we didn't learn the habits, the kind of submissive habits of our parents. So our parents were taught to basically defer to white folks, right? And because it was very dangerous if you did not. So this generation, we didn't come out of the environment where
So you had different survival skills that gave your parents and gave you different avenues of how to interact with white supremacy culture. So your parents managed white supremacy culture through, I mean, not saying that they agreed with the choices that were being provided to them, of course, but that's how they knew how to survive. And how you all were surviving was culturally drastically different because it wasn't even a conversation, right? You were even having with them.
Yes, I think my generation had a more confrontational attitude and style, you know, and so
More upfront conversations,
confrontation, you know, and challenge, you know, like white attitudes and white practices. But it was very dangerous to challenge that basic form of white supremacy because you had the Klan. It was a lot of brutality, and so yeah, it was much more dangerous in the South, you know, like to confront white racism, white attitudes, and white arrogance. But people in my generation, you know, much more willing to get into fistfights, you know, like getting loud in their face, and those kinds of things. So it's this fight back attitude, and I think that's why we were able, and it was doing that rebellion. And then we growing up, many of those workers are doing this period of rebellion, right? I mean, you just had the U.S. government sending their soldiers, sending their troopers, and all of that. So I mean, people were in a very combative mood. So these are the workers we're attempting to organize, and that's why they were open to our messages of uniting Black folks and getting organized. So they were kind of receptive to that, given that who they are. They were young, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, you know, and plus the men had this masculine warrior kind of attitude anyway. Okay, want to fight back. So that made organizing under those conditions favorable, you know, for having some effect on them, right? And then also mention about the during that early part when I returned about why some of my comrades and I uh, sort of formed the Black Panther Party in the city of Detroit. Right? So, you know, the Black Panther Party was first.
Sorry, could you talk a little bit about, was this after Drum?
This was during Drum, right? That's why.
Oh,
so
so
it runs parallel. And,
okay. Why did you, or so you all started Drum and the Black Panther Party in Detroit at the same time?
Yeah, during the basically during the same time.
Okay.
And the reason why we have some of us like John Williams and myself and Marianne Kramer and others were part of the Black Panther Party. This is what was happening. The FBI targeted and labeled the Black Panther Party as the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States, right? The Black Panther Party, so the Black Panther Party appealed to a lot of young folks who wanted to fight back against the US government. And the Black Panther Party had a newspaper, a very effective newspaper that was widely read. And they had some powerful images, usually with young Black people with guns. You know, these guns, they were kind of symbolic for defense, defending against police repression, against police aggression, against police brutality. Now, the message wasn't to go out there and have a shootout with the police, right? It was just saying, essentially, is that you had a right to bear arms and you had a right for self-defense, ultimately that. But in many young people, you know, in their teens and 20s, wanted to get involved in the Panthers. But the Panthers, the older Panthers, the ones who like Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, they learned, they found out very early that the growth of the party was going kind of in the wrong direction, meaning that a lot of young people were joining the Panther Party, and they thought that the main strategy was to confront the police and to go out and prepare militarily.
Why do you think that was young people's narrative at that time? And what made you to decide that you wanted to be a part of creating different opportunities for young Black people at that time?
Okay, well, we knew that, see, here we are, you know, I'm 27, and so I'm not 17 or 18, like a lot of the like the guys who are talking about forming a Black Panther Party, right? So and we knew that it was very dangerous for a lot of these young people to form a Panther Party because they didn't have political education, they weren't sophisticated enough to deal with the politics of the city, the politics of the government, and they would probably make a lot of serious mistakes. And so we felt some kind of a obligation not to let young people in Detroit form a party and get out and have.
Can you tell me a little bit more about these mistakes that you felt like they were making? And because I mean, they must have been, you know, impactful enough for you to for you all to like make a pivot, right? Because it looks like, and I'm just curious because when you're working with Drum, that's like that's a personal narrative. That's something that your generation, because you guys are coming, you know, you guys are in the workforce, so you all are in these spaces, and just wondering if do you feel like both organizations supported the Black community, but it was also divided by age, where you are creating the Black Panther chapter in Detroit, but it's very like a youthful based organization. And then with Drum, are you seeing an older Black population that's ready to like radicalize themselves, or was there any overlap between both organizations since you're doing it at the same time? Because in your information that you were writing, it said that that union workers like that you did like boycott for 2 weeks, and that was really like pivotal because the workers wanted to take action and wanted to be very communicative with management that what was happening was not should not be occurring.
Okay. What was happening with the let me deal with what the dangers are. And the dangers tend to be real because a lot of after I and some of my other comrades left the Black Panther Party because we recognized that it was really going in a very dangerous direction. And as a result, some of those Black Panther Party members got into shootouts and were killed. They were died. I mean, so we got out.
So you were So you were becoming more and more aware that
because
there was a larger police or gun violence that was
happening. That's
happening.
why we wanted to get early and found it ourselves, and we wanted the Black Panther Party, those members, to be involved in organizing our community, organizing workers, organizing students, doing that sort of thing, rather than what they wanted to do. Their idea was to have an office, to sandbag the office, have weapons, and sort of have a bastion where they're going to hold out. So I think so later I wrote about the shootouts that they had with the police, and many of them got jailed and all because they thought that's what there was some shootouts in Oakland, but that a lot of that stuff, the older as the party in Oakland grew, they were trying to dampen down that kind of direction. Say, hey, you guys need more political education. You need kind of strategies. So they went. That's why they began to really have a more in Oakland, have a more community emphasis and have breakfast for children, right? And doing those kinds of work. And then, like my friend who's a doctor, Talbot Small, he was a doctor for the Panther Party. He said, I'm going to provide my resources and my skills to help out and help wide. So we say we have to do community work, and that's what the direction, rather than going here and confront police with guns, those other sort of things. So when John Williams, myself, and Mary, we left that when some of them were insistent that they are going to model what they thought the Oakland was doing. In other words, having an office. When I was there, we didn't have a Black Panther office. Right? We don't need an office that will be targeted by the police, will be harassed by the police. No, what we do is have our meetings, and then we go out, and if you're a student in the schools, you organize the students. If you have a job, you organize on that, right? And those kinds of things. So there was a lot of progressive things about the Black Panther Party. For instance, there was the Peace and Freedom Party was involved in electoral politics. And our chapter, Black Panther Party, when I was in there, and John Williams was out, we would go to campuses and distribute leaders and have speakers. And we have some of the Panthers from Oakland, speak. It was sponsored by the Inner City Boys and all. So there were some very mature elements in the Panther Party, but there was a lot of kind of naive and over undisciplined elements. I'll put it, that's the best way to with limited political education. So among those Black Panther parties and people who were former Panthers, there was a wide gap in the people's levels of political education, people's understanding of the politics, the political dynamics, operating at various levels. So it went from people who were very, very politically astute to people who basically had a comic book kind of idea about what revolution was about. Okay. So one of the points I was making is that when I mentioned the Black Panther Party, I want to mention that we were part of that and forming it, and what in my intent. My intent was not to become a Black Panther Party per se, was to use the Black Panther Party as as a way of recruiting students to get involved in the Black liberation movement through the organization of workers and community groups, rather than have a group of people who had, well, we're building an army kind of mentality. And that's why we have these guns. We're going to eventually get into this armed confrontation with the US government. And that was, that was kind of a fantasy. So many of them had those military fantasies in their head in terms of, like the warrior thing. And of course, that was part of the naive. So there was a lot of internal conflicts within the Panther Party itself, because of the tension and the conflict. And of course, it was the Panther Party was targeted by every police department, city department, and the federal government. And then they had many infiltrators, police agents within the Black Panther Party. And some people, those guys would come to the meeting, we say they were all panther down. They had panther hat, panther things, and all that, all trying to come out, nothing but agents, okay, to infiltrate and to undermine what we were doing. So
how did you all navigate that, since you said like there were police officers that were infiltrating, your community-based meetings to like support the Black community? How did you navigate this like kind of like Black on Black crime of police officers using Black bodied police officers to further incriminate the Black community? How did you all talk about that or navigate it? Since again, it's a conversation now too, right? And how Black bodies are tokenized, and maybe aren't in true alignment with equitable practices for Black identifying people.
Well, number one, in terms of identifying people who come to the meetings, many of them, well, some of them were low-level agents. Okay, I mean, sometimes they use infiltrators, and that's they may have a person with a record, and they say, okay, if you go and join this movement and all that, we'll lighten your sentence, and so there's various kinds of ways that people infiltrate. So some might be actually on a police agent, but many times they're not police agent per se, but they're police tools, right? And sometimes they're making deals because they have a criminal record, and they were trying to make a deal with to reduce the number of years or get off parole or something like that, and say, if you do this, then we will lighten your sentence or something like that. So those are the kind of deals. And some of these little agents, they're kind of low level, because I remember one person come around to the meetings and saying, you know what, I know where there's a whole railroad coach, full of guns, full of weapons, M16s and all that. And I mean, if we can, we can get all this big supply, people coming up with all kind of conspiracies, some kind of schemes and all that, So our thing was, how do we deal with folks who want to infiltrate and all that? First of all, we operate above board. Everybody's talking about, having some kind of secret meetings, doing some things about, stealing some weapons and all that. Oh, no. First of all discussions about above board, and all of our plans are very concrete with people we know, or people who know somebody else, right? So anything that has to do with, some secretive kinds of things that would be viewed as criminal activity, no, we just don't deal with those kind of folks. No, you're in the wrong meeting. We're not talking about that. And so anything that is really confidential, that stays within the inner core. That only stays with people who are your very close friends. Their mother, father, blah, blah. I mean, it's that kind of trust. So it's the level of trust that determines what you will discuss. Okay. And for most of those folks, you don't need to be doing anything.
How did you assess trust as you loop trip? How do you assess that people's political identities, that they're a trusting person to you?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to know their history, right? I have no, so you can't trust anybody unless you know in depth their character and their history. So that's automatically gonna keep your circle fairly tight and fairly close, right? And then the circle has to do with, to what extent do the people you trust someone that they trust, right? So that's how trust operates in a circle. First of all, people you trust because you know them personally, it's intimate, and and you think that they are true to the cause, and they have they are viewed as honorable, somebody that was credible. So it has to do with a character reading, right? And it's just like some of your friends. Some friends you may call friends, but there's a limit to how much you trust them, right? So it varies even among your friends to what extent you trust, members of it. So basically, what I use is personal history and personal interactions with that person and how they're viewed by others. So I view that person as trustworthy, and people I know view them as trustworthy. I mean, nobody can be 100% trustworthy. I mean, to what extent do you even trust yourself to do something? Okay, all right. So that's how that's what I use. Their history and people and the reputation they have among people who I trust. Right?
Can you talk to me a little bit about the trust and relationship that you had during your young adulthood in Detroit with John Watson, General Baker, John Wilson? How were you all able to consistently have that trust and to build multiple organizations that don't solely support you and your immediate families? Because again, you said earlier that a lot of you are coming from this homogeneous identity. So if that's a part of the story, the sameness that you all have, and can you talk a little bit about how because it seems like a very fruitful relationship that you had with these other Black men.
Okay. Again, with John Williams, General Baker, John Watson, Charles Simmons, and others, we have worked together in our organization called Uhuru, and Charles Johnson too. So we got to know each the character, the character of all of those. So we had a working history, struggling for common goals. Although we worked together and all, we didn't have all the same interests and all. For instance, sometimes some of us, for instance, General Baker and Charles Simmons maybe had a group because they were kind of more cultural nationalists. They had their circles. And John Williams, Charles Johnson, and I were more kind of Marxist-Leninists. So we had, in terms of, so it wasn't like we were all kind of, solid in way. But we were solid when it came to our organization, and we shared a political vision and personal trust, and we knew each other's family, and we knew, it wasn't superficial, okay? No. So that trust was having to do with types of characters we knew from our community and their community, so we can read folks, and see and tell and see what kind of character they are, making a character kind of reading. So our trust came from our working with each other, and we had a work history with each other. And so, and as you said, our similarity, having the same kind of a history, our family, all of us were first generation. General Baker, Charles Johnson, we first generation. All of our parents were Southern born and Southern raised. and we're the children of that. So we knew our roots, and our roots were the same, right?
So it's kind of going back to the first generation identity. So a common thing, at least common in the difference of cultures that like I exist in, you talk a lot about like where do you come from? So when you're talking about this first generation Southern identity, did you all ever talk about like your family's experiences in the South? Where exactly in the South did your families grow up in? Because I think, at least for myself, that those have been recent conversations I've had with other African-American individuals of like, well, like where down South? Because one of my close friends, her family grew up in Tennessee, and it's actually like 30 minutes away from Atoka, Tennessee, from where you're from. So then it kind of gave me ideas about, oh, I wonder if our families knew each other potentially, or were they potentially enslaved with each other or not. So I think those kind of conversations have been presenting themselves, I think, particularly with the murder of George Floyd, and kind of evaluating what does this African-American identity mean? Because in Minnesota, we have such high populations of immigrant populations. So I think understanding all of those cultures is really key. So I'm just wondering, when you all talk about, you know, this Southern influence, where your families are from the South, do you talk about like these little what that means, and breaking that down a little bit more in conversation with your?
No, I never had that conversation. You know, remember when my family moved from actually Memphis, I was born in Atoka, but they were at the point that my parents moved to Michigan. I was about 2.5 or 3 years old. So I have no memory of living in the South, period. And I never had a discussion with my parents about life in the South, you know, those kind of. And then when I was with, John Williams, Charles Johnson, and those, I don't recall us having discussions about the South and our Southern roots. There was very little discussion about that. It was discussion. Our discussion was around fighting on the contemporary scene, you know. So we weren't rehashing, you know, blah, 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 and all that in casual conversation. Usually it was about the present, about exchanging or commenting about current events as it related to Black people, and strategies about sharing some of the literature that we were reading, right? Because we had to seek out radical literature on our own, and sometimes we would talk about, well, you know, what did the Bolsheviks do in 1917 in the Russian Revolution, right? What did these folks do to that? What about basically Frantz Fanon? You know, did you read his book? What did he say? Blah, blah. So it's these kind of conversations where we didn't talk about the lives of our parents in the South.
So I feel like it's pretty common now to talk a lot about your origin story. And do you think, and not that you can like go back in time, but since it's a large conversation to talk about intersectionalities and all the complexities of like who you are, which you kind of explained, right? Like maybe appearance wise, your group of friends are looking homogeneous as activists, but that you all are very complex beings, of course. Mm-hmm. So how do you think your work has changed with that evolving identity, if that's something that you identify as the person with like multiple intersectionalities? How has that changed your activism work? And would it have changed your work with organizing DRUM or the Black Panther Party? And that'll be my last question.
Okay. With a DRUM, I had the vision, and we had a strategy to build a sort of an independent Black political party, right? my strategy in 2022 has changed. I think that we can build Black organizations, but I think the principal political organization must be multiracial. And I think the multiracial theme should be the dominant theme. I think one of the dominant, well, maybe not dominant, but still a very powerful theme was having working towards a Black nation, you know. And so I think we have, I mean, the fact is that the nation in North America, it's got to be a multiracial nation. So I think it's the racial theme, I think, is becoming increasingly prominent. And that is the historical direction. Well, what are the indicators of that historical direction? Well, the fastest growing population is the mixed race population in this country. And there's more and more interracial intimate relationships, and that's growing despite, you know, the polarization among different lines. And I think that there's a effort to restrict folks in terms of the narrowing, but there's a big pushback in terms of identities. I mean, people are having a sort of the relationships that have been sort of more and more greater acceptance in terms of homosexual relationships, transsexual relationships. All of those things are pushing and opening up societies to broader ideas. But there's a tremendous pushback. And then the idea about people in the 60s talking about building the traditional family unit. Well, you know, mom and pop and kids and all that. Well, I think that's still desirable, but that's not the dominant model out here, and how people define and how families are forming in 2022. Where, you know, in the Black community, you know, single parent family is the dominant, you know, form. And those forms things are constantly changing. And then the vision about what will be the desirable are the vision for a good society. My vision of good society is much more complex than it was in the 1960s. And even in terms of the economy, what should it look like? Well, I think I had a more rigid kind of idea about about socialism. And so my idea about what a socialist society would look like is different from the idea I had about a socialist society. The social society that I had about society in the 1960s was one that was more rigid, you know, and things were little more boxes. But the society I see now is not these little boxes and walls. There's all kind of flexibility and filters. You know, it's much more complex and much more dynamic. So my ideas about organization, who to organize, and how the society works varies significantly different from the ideas I have in my head in the 1960s. And what has changed that is my observation and concrete things that have occurred. You know, in the 1960s, I think that the Soviet Union would grow stronger and broader, but we see in 1991, it collapsed, right? And then you have all these little highly nationalistic groups breaking up, you know, Serbs fighting Croats, Russians fighting Ukrainians, all these breakups, right? All this fracturing. And then I have the idea that, you know, you have a United States of Africa, and you see all the fighting going on in Ethiopia, right? Within it, all these fractions, all this unsatisfied. So in all these places, you see, and that tells you something about human beings, and it's also about social groups. And then you have to go and rethink and review your understanding of group dynamics and who people really are. And that if you understand human nature, you know, you were really, you know, and immediately there's no such thing as a utopia. There's always going to be conflict. Anytime you have a social situations, meaning there's two or more people involved, there's going to be division. Okay. So there's divisions within families, divisions among married couples, divisions among boyfriend and girlfriend, because that's our uniqueness is also will express itself. And as a result of that kind of unique aspects that all of us have that's going to run and clash with the uniqueness of a person, because everything doesn't kind of come together. So as you mature, as you observe more, your understanding of the world and how it works becomes much more sophisticated. If you pay attention, if you study, if you observe very closely, and if you begin to bring some concepts and come up with some concepts that help you understand these patterns that exist. So right now, of course, I think I'm much more wiser than I was in 1960s. I have lived many years beyond those I had over another half a century to look at things and reflect on things and have a deeper understanding of how the world works. So I have more fluid ways of seeing things and changing my conceptions of things.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll continue next time.
Do you want to stop recording?
Okay, let me see if and then see if Comrade is around.